This time you have the Chinese Commerce Minister Wang Wentao traveling to Paris to meet with his European counterpart on the sidelines of the WTO meeting. So whether or not this will lead to some, or at least pave the way for some sort of concrete deliverables in July when those EU officials travel to Beijing. That is something we want to look out for, whether they will continue to perhaps look into picking up discussion of an investment pact that had been put on hold for many years, or perhaps lowering tariffs on Chinese EVs. These are, of course, things to look out for, and whether they will look to deepen trade cooperation as well as both sides counter those impact of US tariffs.
Yeah, and manufacturing strength remaining a theme in China as well. Tell us a little bit about this new version of the Made in China plan that Beijing is said to be preparing.
Yeah, so China first introduced the Made in China plan in 2015. It was a 10-year plan that's supposed to sort of expire by 2025. And we understand that policymakers are now looking at a new iteration of this plan, a decade-long sort of blueprint to map out China's manufacturing capabilities over the next 10 years. And once again, it is expected to focus on high-tech manufacturing, especially things like chip-making gears, given those curbs from the U.S. and how that has threatened China's national security. Here you can see in the pie chart that manufacturing has remained a pretty big part of China's share of GDP, and we understand from policymakers that they plan to keep that share of GDP contributed by manufacturing stable in the mid to long term. And again, this doesn't seem to, address that criticism from the U.S. of the trade imbalance, because that concentration in manufacturing has been one of the key drivers of that imbalance. And this is despite as well Chinese policymakers acknowledging that they need to boost domestic consumption. We know there is this ongoing debate among policymakers as to whether to place a target on how much consumption should contribute as a share of GDP. But according to sources, policymakers are still leaning against putting a target there because they're unsure whether they have enough policy tools to really ramp up consumption in a big way.
The PBOC has also strengthened requirements for banks to step up yuan transactions. So what does this tell us when it comes to currency policy priorities for Beijing?
Yeah, so the PBOC has asked major lenders to step up yuan cross-border trade transactions from 25 to 40%. So back in 2024, the total yuan transactions was about 30%, according to the PBOC governor. So this shows you China's determination to really ramp up the pace of the adoption of yuan in global transactions, which has increased over the past years. But it's still, if you look at the global share of yuan in SWIFT payments, it's only 3.5% for now. And this comes as there has been some concerns about the attractiveness of dollar assets. And of course, this increased requirement from the Chinese banks, it will likely increase the demand for the yuan as well. And this comes as the yuan has strengthened about 2% or so far against the dollar this year.
All right, Bloomberg's China correspondent MINMIN Lo there. Well, China's Premier Li Qiang says China's aiming to strengthen cooperation with Southeast Asian and Gulf nations as he meets with leaders at the ASEAN summit in Malaysia. Bloomberg's Avril Hong is in Kuala Lumpur for us. So, Avril, tell us about some of the areas of cooperation that we might see.
Yeah, Paul, I mean, this is day 2 of the ASEAN summit in Kuala Lumpur, and the big event is still going to be that ASEAN GCC China summit that takes place this afternoon. We've already been hearing from the Chinese Premier Li Qiang and how China is really looking forward to cooperating with the GCC and the ASEAN countries, that they're willing to step up positive contributions in order to uphold the interests of the global South. So a sign of the times, really, I think. It's also worth highlighting that when it comes to the Chinese delegation, up until yesterday evening, we weren't quite sure who was going to be part of the entourage along with China's number 2, Li Qiang. And our reporter, Josh Xiao, actually spotted the Chinese Commerce Minister, Wang Wentao, and the PBOC Governor, Pang Gongsheng. So a really strong lineup and showing here the commitment from China to the region. To your question about areas of cooperation, we've already heard that this could include infrastructure, potentially projects when it comes to energy as well. But of course, this all comes with challenges. ASEAN and GCC's first summit was actually just last year. So now China is in the mix. As I said, this is the first time this trilat is going to be taking place. Thus, this break from the bilateral format potentially complicate things when it comes to agenda setting, when it comes to achievable outcomes as well.
We're also seeing Emmanuel Macron in the region as well. All sorts of alliances being struck here with Vietnam.
Yeah, Macron in Vietnam. A day ago, I was just discussing with you guys about how energy as well as transport industries could be in the mix as areas of cooperation. We're since hearing that defense is also part of the engagement between Vietnam and France with the signing of framework agreements for defense projects. Also hearing how France is pledging support for sectors in Vietnam, including high-speed rail. So all in, France and Vietnam drawing closer in terms of ties. And certainly this is against the backdrop of potentially their exports getting hit from Trump's tariffs. Macron is making this multi-stop tour of Southeast Asia. After this, he goes on to Indonesia, and then he sort of ends the week in Singapore. He's not the only leader to be making similar trips to the region. We've seen these from the Chinese, Spanish, Japanese sides as well. So certainly, Southeast Asia is in the spotlight.
Bloomberg's Avril Hong there at the ASEAN Summit in Kuala Lumpur. And we do have more ahead here on the Asia Trade. This is Bloomberg.